In analyzing the mission to corrupt, we are going to look at 4 separate examples, 4 separate written works to get a better understanding of what this mission is. And it is very old. It has been taking place for a long time. Our first written work are the voyages through the different wild nations of the Americas, or of America. Septentrional. It was written by John Long, who was a traveler or a trader and interpreter of different Indian languages. This book was translated from the English to French with additional interesting notes by JBLJ Biacoco, or Biacocu. And this is the 1794 edition. On page 60, we get a description of the time period, which explains how the missionaries were viewed. On this page, it states the French are not very blamable, or more blamable than other nations, and they cover, or we cover, very lightly the others through our discussions, and the fake devoutes do not possess the very religion for the cause that they are of the heart to keep. And bear with me, this is my own translation of this work from French, which was originally translated from English. But of course, if you were to look up the English version, you will find quite a bit of revision, and most of it fake. Most of the English versions are fake. I believe this one is overlooked because it is a translation. But in continuation, it states, to the point of those Indians that are accustomed to the society of commerce, and the same of English preachers, I remark with shame their sentiments, their manners, their habits are very different. They are corrupted. They are very degenerative. They are to increase the violence of passion that reason cannot vanquish. The lies and the promises, vices that they have, unfortunately, from us. And of course, this part, he is talking about the corruption of Indians by missionaries. That assertion, in continuation, quote, that assertion is supported by the testimony of Monsieur Sargent, citizen of the New England. The report that through a voyage among the Shawnee Indian allies, a fervent part of the 6 nations and whichever other tribes, they released with disdain the proliferation that they're made of the instruction through the Christian religion, that it is in the reproach the same, their worship, and he said that they trade of the other purpose or propose that to deceive, abuse, and corrupt the young children and married women the same, while the spouses are out of the house. They add that the Senecas have promised in their yielding the country to never again receive Christianity on the part of the English. And of course, in this section, it is talking about specifically the conduct of Anglican missionaries, or the English missionaries. And in speaking about the Indians, which are specifically the Iroquois, on page 62, it talks about further implications, and in this part it states that the English, part of the vices and immorality to trade that they have the custom of renting criminals and to pay or hire infamed men or men of bad fame, infamous, to transport their merchandise among the Indians. And they are the worst subjects, and et cetera, et cetera. Now in 61, we get a better description and specifically a mention of the evangelical missionaries. It states that, I bring more proof. The Governor Hunter presents to Indians by order of the Queen Anne of manners and of other things, that they are very agreeable, and address them through a suggestion that was had at Albany. He said that the Queen, her good mother, and not only fit to them use of clothes for the body, but that she proposed yet to adorn their bitterness for the preaching of the evangelicals, and that she should send missionaries for the instruction. So basically, you have these missionaries that are drinking to excess and causing problems, and the Indians don't like it, and to rectify that issue, she makes to send more for the instruction. As soon as the governor is finished with discourse, the oldest among the chiefs will be brought, and he said that to make of all the Indians, he recognized the Queen as a good mother, of good manners, that she will send or set that forth the ministers they had left, whichever ones their tasted of their preaching the evangel. They learn to drink in excess, to deceive and to quarrel among themselves, and he pleaded to the governor of their removal, or of the removal of the preachers, thus that pleasant Europeans might come among them. He added that what had arrived to the Indians were of honest, or that would arrive to in replace of the ministers, honest men, sober and pure. That today, this part is actually saying that they originally arrived sober and pure and honest men, but that today they are the most horrible of subjects, that at one time they had the faith of God, but that today they believe in flesh to their existence. And of course, if that's not a damning description of the time period and what was thought of missionaries, that would actually still be considered impolite behavior today. However, when it comes to the description of said Indians, as far as the Iroquois are concerned, it states that they are extremely jealous and offend easily. When, in faith, they are suspicious, it is very difficult to destroy or remove the impression. They take the resentments to the grave, and to the next generation they tell what happened. They, in society with them, or in association with them, are all in admiration of their heroic valor in battle, their resignation to support or endure the cruelest of torments, and the constance of their attachment. They can't deplore the terrible effects of their resentment that have no bounds. It is that violence of character or conduct, in general extreme, which is difficult to subjugate and very dangerous to encourage. Very restrained, they attribute it to fear. A great strength or vigor produces the desire for vengeance. The nations that are allied with them are always with the aim of destroying the prejudices deeply rooted, and that despite the natural inclination of the human heart to maintain them, they will not become fatal to society if they are not fortified by the advice and examples of the elderly. they have endeavored to soften their customs in introduction among them the Christian religion. Of their precepts admirables are their proposed to destroy all bloodthirsty inclination, to render the human genre happier and the members of the great family better in how they see others. If it is permitted to see how to prove of a reform, that to remark to the outsider in saying that the French, our neighbors, are successful completely through that laudable enterprise. The sage manners of the inhabitants of the pleasant Indian villages in Canada justifies that I advance. Monsieur Jacques Adair is not yet of this view. He intends, to the contrary, that the French Canadians merit great reproaches for depraving our placid Indians of the North by way of their infernal dogma. I am a long way from declaring an advocate of believed enemies to society's ease. I believe always the most severe reproach, as if it is to be said that the priests exercise at one time on them a great influence. They are inspired by a fake zeal of sentiments little favorable to English. I am not less of the news that they are long time employed all their efforts for the instilling the maxims of the evangelical. In truth, it is always a thing most deplorable that to see of men made to serve the people of the religion, or to serve the people or the religion, to the interest of one to the other, but above all can among the French are not very blamable that of other nations. And here in this part, we get a description, or an accurate description, of not only the prospect of the Indians, a practical explanation of the missionaries that were sent among them. And this perspective particularly comes from an English writer. So let's look at the situation of the French, which are indeed reprehensible, or were reprehensible, showing that this is not simply an issue among one people group, one nation, or one specific religion, but in fact all of them. In the Levantine Adventurer, the travels and missions of the Chevalier d'Arvoux, 1653 to 1697, by Warren H. Lewis, and this is a first edition. On page 197, we get a description of the French perspective, which is very different from simple debauchery and drinking to excess, or bad manners. Instead, it states, quote, "Matters had rested thus until Dupont's reign, and he," quote within a quote, "knowing that the nation wrote unceasingly to Versailles begging for his dismissal, threw himself into the hands of the Jesuits and implored their protection, which he got at a price. Father Besson, S.J., who thought that Dupont had the makings of a useful servant of the society, volunteered to act as his secretary. He wrote all his official letters for him, and as he was a man of ability, they were good ones, and hid Dupont's inefficiency from Colbert, who was thus fooled completely." Now, this first paragraph shows false representation, or more basically stated, fraud. Pretending to be someone he wasn't. And this is a common trait among Jesuits, specifically propagandists today. Not just Jesuits, but it's very well known with Jesuits as far as misrepresentation and pretending to be someone they're not, and revision. And in the second paragraph, it states, quote, "Then came a demand for the first installment of payment for services rendered. The Franciscan chaplain to the consul was also the parish curé, and the Jesuits caused Dupont to replace him as chaplain by a Jesuit, while leaving him undisturbed in the office of parish priest. By immemorial custom, the curé was the arbiter in any dispute between the consul and a Frenchman, and soon after this, the curé made an award which ran counter to Dupont's wishes. Dupont, in collusion with the Jesuits, retaliated by reporting to Versailles that the Franciscans were Spaniards, enemies of the king, did not offer the customary prayers for him, and that he was dismissing them from his chapel. So far, so good, thought the Jesuits, but Dupont, who was already finding their rule galling, suddenly swung around and offers his chaplaincy to the Capuchins. But the Jesuits were not to be so easily shaken off as Dupont had hoped. Perhaps he had forgotten that Louis XIV's confessor was a Jesuit, but if so, he was soon reminded by the arrival from home of letters patent preserving the office of consular chaplain to the Society of Jesus, but without prejudice to the right of the parish curé to say the parish mass in the consular chapel. Now, in this passage, we get a specific and practical example of how the Jesuits, French Jesuits, corrupt. And they do it through fraud and pretending to be someone that they're not, and extortion, which is very obvious. But at least in this example, we get a practical description and evidence of this very thing taking place. But we will look further into this video and find more. But on page 41, it specifically relates to missionaries. From the French perspective, we already got the English one. And it stated, quote, "Neither class was conspicuous for its gratitude, but of the two, the missionaries were much the bigger nuisance. For the Echelles," wrote a consul, "they are a source of expense and embarrassment by their indiscretion, their quarrels, and their indocility. Thanks to Louis XIV's missionary fervor, their numbers were constantly increasing. At Aleppo, for instance, there were 8 in 1670, but 28 in 1681. Nor did these exhaust the calls on a consul's purse, for as a matter of routine, he was expected to offer lavish entertainment to the French community and members of friendly nations. The senseless waste was de rigueur in all consulates. Take, for example, a guest's account of a dinner party in the Alexandretta consulate in 1675. Quote within quote, a prince like dinner, every health we drank. Every man broke the glass he drank in, so that before night we had destroyed a whole chest of fine Venice glasses. And another tells us that the great days were celebrated with superb banquets from which the hardest heads had difficulty in withdrawing in a seemly condition. Louis XIV's most trifling victories were made the excuse for such extravagant festivities that ultimately the Marseille Chamber of Commerce had to issue orders that no celebration was to take place without its sanction, and even then the cost was not to exceed a stipulated sum. And of course, in that passage we find out that, oh look, the French missionaries at the time were in fact exactly the same as the English missionaries at the time, drinking to excess and full of bad manners. And it's no surprise when we find out how boys were treated at the time period by such people. And we get a true perspective of the reprehensible nature of the religious class or orders or clergy, whatever one would like to call them. It stated that discipline for novices was severe. A trivial fault was punished by keeping the offender on his knees in the choir throughout all the offices of the day. A more serious one was dealt with by depriving him of his cross for a specified period, and for a grave fault the sinner was given the sacristy, or in other words, whipped in that place. This rather shocked D'Arvu as treatment for gentlemen wearing swords, and he is careful to point out that the punishment did not dishonor the recipient. If it should happen to shock us too, let us remember that these gentlemen were in fact boys of 14 or 15, many of whom had been forced into the order because they were a nuisance to their families. So there you get a perfect description of child abuse done by the church and continues today. And of course, that is why you get the Stockholm Syndrome among many of the abused that they send out as their missionaries. And then in the Memoirs de l'Amérique, or Memories of the Septentrional America, and the suite of travels by Monseigneur Le Baron de Lahontan. I believe that's Mr. Monseigneur. This is the second edition, but in this work we get a perfect example of revisionism and fraud, specifically made by Jesuits. Now, the first and most obvious tell or giveaway that this work was not actually written in the 17th century is that the Sun King, so-called, alleged, Louis XIV is simply referred to as that, Louis XIV. No grace or his honorable father or any of that stuff, which we get in the original example where the Queen Anne was referred to as her good mother. And they had all these different ways of referring to royalty, which is not represented in this work. And he is given a Your Majesty, and that the king was well served, and then adds in a Monsieur de something for good effect. But he does refer to the king as simply Louis XIV, which is the writing of somebody who is not afraid of castigation for incorrectly paying deference or reverence to a king. And this writer also includes multiple MR, as with the title of the book, which in the original, which came after this one, allegedly, only the M without the R is included, which automatically tells you that this was not actually written at that time that it's pretending to be written, which was in the 17th century, considering the French in the 17th century would have simply written an M and not an MR. But this also states that the poor people in reference to the Indians. And that is completely contrary to the way that people looked at it, and also contrary to the quote that came from the first book, allegedly written by the Baron de Lahontan, who stated that the Iroquois were free and sovereign through natural right. He would not have referred to them as the poor people. And then we get a comment or the first quote or the first reference to the Jesuits. And there will be many more in this book, showing the identity of the writer to be Jesuit. And then, of course, we have another MR, which is the English way of writing Mr., but not the French one for writing Monsieur. He also refers to the Sauvage Sedentaire, which would be sedentary savages, which, first of all, savage was not used in that way. They did not refer to the indigenous as savages, but rather as Indians. And if they did refer to them as savages, it would have been as Indian savages, because sauvage meant wild. And so sedentary wilds doesn't make any sense, because you can't have sedentary wilds. That is illogical. The idea of sedentarianism is to stay in one place. And that phrase would not have been used by anyone at the time in the 17th century. But we also get inconsistencies in this book that mark the writer as a fraud, as revising the intent of the original writer and pretending to be him. That's called identity theft and is also considered part of fraud. And in this, on page 58, we get the word Iroquois written with an S at the end, but also an F and an E on the same page. That is an inconsistency. And there's other inconsistencies in this book. He also refers to the Danish or Danois Frederick Anschild, which is not exactly the way that they talked in the 17th century. And then we also get a reference to the Americans, also would not have been written by somebody from that time period. And then we also get the crocodiles, again, spelled with no F, of the Mississippi, spelled with 3 F's and no S. And then he also refers to the Nile as the Nile. And of course, neither of those would be done by anyone in the time period. However, we do get a phantom of the original author when it is written a espèces de chats sauvages, which would, of course, it's showing that wild cats, and it's using the word sauvage in the way that they would have used it, which was to refer to something as being wild. And then we get other examples of the MR versus the simple M, but this writer also decides he will capitalize the G in governor. Also not something that they did, as reference to our first example. And instead of paying deference to a king, who he refers to simply as the king, or Louis XIV in that first section, he refers to a baron as Le Baron de Saint-Castin, gentilhomme de Orléans and Berne. So it's gentleman of Orléans and Berne. So that's a lot of deference and reverence being paid to a entity who would have been lower than a king and less reverence paid to a king. But this writer also refers to the Grand Chief as being a sovereign of the nation. Now that is highly incorrect and would not have been mentioned by anyone of the time period, not only because a Grand Chief did not exist, but because a chief or chef was not, in fact, a sovereign of the nation, and this very writer, allegedly, or at least the original writer, the one not pretending to be the writer and is being a fraud, but the original true writer wrote that the Iroquois were, in fact, considered as sovereign every individual through natural right, so they would not have had something equivalent to a sovereign. And then, of course, in this book, which is clearly an identity theft fraud, we have many references to Jesuits, but it is not complete without a quotation in Latin, as they like to do, as well as reference and or paying homage to their fantasy of the Roman Empire. So they usually do those two things, sometimes together, sometimes one or the other, but they either pay homage, they will pay homage to Rome, and they might do it through quoting Latin or speaking in Latin, or they'll do it just by referencing Rome and the great power of the empire. And this writer also talks about the political governors, civil and ecclesiastical and military, and their importance. And of course, the people that love to talk about ecclesiastical authority are, in fact, Jesuits and priests and other people that come from that cesspool that is Rome, basically. And he also talks about the power in the hands of the Jesuits, which is another reference to his perspective as being a Jesuit. And also talks about the Jansenites and the Molinites, but he talks quite a bit about various religious groups and their influence and importance, which is not something that the original author would have written about in a tale of his travels through the Americas. Well, basically, it's just saying that the lieutenant of the infantry and many other important people in Canada would essentially search out the consultation of the fathers or of the Jesuits. So essentially stating that in the past, the Jesuits had all the power because all the people of importance always searched out their advice, which, as according to not only our first but our second example, would have been far from the truth at the time period. And then he also ascribes to the Jesuits the entire trade of fur and other merchandise in the Americas, as if that's believable. And he also stated that they did not engage in conflict between one another. Well, if that claim does not tell you the true purpose of the fraud that is this work, then, well, there's many others. Many other examples. And it also states that received a great opposition on the part of the savages, spelled again in the way that would not have been written, and to the great understanding of the truth of Christianity. And that right there tells you exactly how the writer views the Indians, being referred to as savages, which runs completely counter to the quote from the first book talking about them, but also that this writer, Baron de la Hontan, likely said that the people were free and sovereign through natural right, as was referenced in the previous video, Whom Dares to Laugh at Kings? Now, in the Osage Indian Customs and Myths by Lewis F. Burns, the first paperback edition, this is a heavily revised work, but gives us a perfect example of the laziness and the way that this same identity theft and fraudulent revisionism is carried out today. But not only that, it also states what the duties of a chief are, which does not, in fact, coincide with the first propagandist Jesuit. And this writer, or revisionist writer, clearly did not reference back to the first revisionist propagandist writer, because he states that when a person engages in fighting, there's a threat to life. The chiefs must stop the fight. The chief from the division of the murderer must require the guilty one to take gifts to the relative of the victim as a peace gesture. And basically all of these responsibilities of a chief have to do with keeping the peace, which very few people today would ever refer to a sheriff or a constable or police or a security guard as being sovereigns. But then this particular revisionist writer, as always, clearly has to pay homage to the great fantasy that is the Roman Empire, when it states, to Western minds, the actual leaders were the next two officers selected. The majority culture has become so accustomed to the concept of one supreme leader that they sometimes forget there are some advantages to two or more supreme leaders. Those masters of military organization, the Romans, operated for some time under a triumvirate. Americans conceive unity to be following one leader. The Osages conceived unity as a consensus of the two grand divisions, Sishu or sky and Hunka or earth. Thus, one leader from each division working together was a united leadership. If one seeks a further advantage, they should note that the Osages were never plagued with strong men on horseback. This expression is used to describe a situation where a strong military leader seizes the government by violent revolution. The United States is one of the few countries in world history to escape this affliction. Like the Osages, the Constitution keeps the military subordinate to the civil government. However, the Osages went a step further and divided military authority as well as a civil authority. Okay, so first in this one paragraph, we get arrogance. Arrogance and also a lack of understanding, because this person is writing completely outside of the same style of the original author. But he also makes multiple claims that are generalizations and incorrect. And they're definitely the work of somebody who's ignorant and sound quite a lot like a university professor who has spent most of their lives in a classroom and in no practical application of knowledge, so they just spout off dogma and rhetoric like this. The First of all, the Romans and the Romans were not masters of military organization. But evidence of their empire, it can only be found in recent acquisition of law through the imposition of Latin dogma and procedure. But the use of Latin in trade development or organic organic evolution through different languages, it's not present. Latin is not present in any way, shape, or form in any language around the world except through academic, legal, and governmental circles. There is nothing as far as Latin is concerned in trade or any sort of organic development that would follow through a true empire. So this whole idea of the Roman Empire controlling as much as it allegedly did is completely a fantasy, and they were not masters of military organization. They were also not very homogeneous, and the triumvirate is nothing. This writer is clearly a Jesuit from Rome, revising and attempting to hijack the identity of an original author and change something that is detrimental and damaging to current propaganda. However, out of probably laziness, but perhaps the serial killer idea of keeping a trophy, this revisionist left in a page from the original author, which gives us theme, tone, and style of the original author and how he spoke. He states, quote, "The prompter sings a short song and recites 1/4 of the footstep prayer at each pause. They then enter the house of mysteries and sit at the east with the parents and child. All of the little old men of the clans mentioned above also enter and take seats to the north or south according to their grand division. When all participants are seated, the assistant proceeds with the wail wa le le, or sending ceremony. This is the sending of fees in the form of gifts to the headman of each participating clan. In return for the fees, each headman recites the story of their clan's life symbol. This is done as soon as the sending is finished. They all recite at the same time. Since this is not in unison or the same words, it seems very confusing at first. At the conclusion of these prayers, the bowl of water and cedar fans, as well as the bowl of shelled corn, are placed before the Tsishu peacemaker headman. The messenger then places the child in the headman's arms. After anointing the child with cedar water and touching the child's lips with corn, the child and bowls are passed to the Ponka peacemaker headman. He too anoints the child and touches its lips with corn. This tender ceremony continues from headman to headman until all have blessed the child in this manner. The ever-flowing waters, the cedar, and corn are all symbols of long, productive life. The mother is seated facing the prompter with a buffalo robe, hair side down between them. Red color has been placed at the head end, center, and tail connected with a red line, see figure 8. In addition, the 4 legs are colored red. These represent dawn at the head and midday at the center and sunset at the tail end. The connecting line represents the sun path. Okay, so first, in this one page, we get multiple references to a headman. And in the rest of the book, there's basically only one. So, the original writer used the word headman a lot, and the revisionist did not. That shows a demonstration in the difference of age. The original writer is older, or was older, than the revisionist Jesuit propagandist. But not only this, the font and spacing is different. And that is simply a demonstration of laziness as far as revisionism goes, I believe. Because even if they were leaving it as a joke, then they would have at least changed the font and the spacing, right? But in another passage, we get the direct correlation to Jesuits and a confirmation of the identity of this revisionist when on page 35 it says, Pane no Pache means not afraid of the Pawnee. And that's a ridiculous name, by the way.